This video is on the vasculature of the upper limb. The arterial supply of the upper limb begins with the axillary artery. The axillary artery is the second part of a single continuous artery that changes its names 3 times. The first part is the subclavian artery, which contributes to the supply of the scapular region, but is considered an artery of the neck. And then the subclavian artery becomes an axillary artery when it crosses the lateral border of the first rib. The axillary artery supplies the shoulder and the pectoral regions, and then it becomes the brachial artery, which is the artery of the arm, after it crosses the inferior border of the teres major. In the elbow region, the brachial artery terminates by dividing into 2 arteries of the forearm, which are the ulnar artery on the medial side and the radial artery on the lateral side. The ulnar and radial arteries typically terminate by anastomosing or communicating with the palm of the hand as the superficial and deep palmar arches. Branches of the axillary artery include the subscapular artery and the anterior and posterior humeral circumflex arteries. The brachial artery gives rise to several branches, including the deep brachial artery, otherwise known as the profunda brachii artery, and the radial artery and ulnar artery. The pink highlighted area is the subclavian artery, and that continues as the axillary artery until it reaches the inferior margin of the teres major. The axillary artery is a continuation of the subclavian artery. It begins at the lateral border of the first rib, and it ends at the inferior border of the teres major. It passes posterior to the pectoralis minor in the arm, and it will become the brachial artery when it passes that inferior border of the teres major. At that point, it's usually reached the humerus. The axillary nerve is divided into 3 parts by the pectoralis minor. The number of the part correlates with the number of branches from that part of the axillary artery. The first part of the axillary artery is between the first rib and the medial border of the pectoralis minor. The second part is posterior to the pectoralis minor, and the third part is from the lateral border of the pectoralis minor to the inferior border of the teres major muscle. The first part of the axillary artery has 1 branch, which is called the superior thoracic artery. The second part has 2 branches, the thoracoacromial and the lateral thoracic arteries. The third part has 3 branches, the subscapular artery and the anterior circumflex humeral and posterior circumflex humeral arteries. The subscapular artery has the greatest diameter but has a very short length. It will terminate as the circumflex scapular and thoracodorsal arteries, and those arteries anastomose around the scapula. The anterior circumflex humeral and the posterior circumflex humeral are going to be opposite the origin of the subscapular artery, and those anastomose and supply the glenohumeral joint. The subscapular artery, the anterior circumflex humeral, and the posterior circumflex humeral arteries are on your lab list. So here we see the axillary artery. Here is the subscapular artery coming off of the third part of the axillary artery. Here is the anterior humeral circumflex artery coming off the opposite side of the third part of the axillary artery. In the picture in the upper right, we can see that anterior humeral circumflex will supply the anterior neck of the humerus. And here's the posterior humeral circumflex artery that originates very close to that anterior humeral circumflex artery. This is a posterior view of the posterior humeral circumflex artery, so you can see how it wraps its way around the back of the arm. The brachial artery provides the main arterial supply to the arm, and it's a continuation of the axillary artery. It begins at the inferior border of the teres major, where the axillary artery ends, and then it ends in the cubital fossa, just opposite the neck of the radius. And there it will divide into the radial and ulnar arteries. The brachial artery is functionally and clinically important because its branches anastomose and surround the elbow. This results in a collateral circulation that allows blood to reach the forearm even when the elbow is flexed, because when the elbow is flexed, it compromises the flow through the terminal part of the brachial artery. So this collateral circulation allows blood to flow into the forearm, into the structures of the forearm, even if the elbow is bent. This diagram illustrates the anastomoses of arteries from the brachial artery surrounding the elbow joint and going into the forearm. So we can see the brachial artery, and the brachial artery branches. You can see a profundi brachii artery or a deep brachial artery branching off. And then at the elbow, we can see the ulnar artery and the radial artery that are terminal branches of the brachial artery. We also see different branches from the brachial artery. There's a humeral nutrient artery, which will feed the humerus. And then we see the collateral branches, the superior ulnar collateral and the inferior ulnar collateral, that join other arteries in this anastomosis around the elbow and into the forearm. This diagram illustrates the relationship of arteries and veins of the arm to the humerus and the different compartments of the arm. The deep brachial artery, or the profunda brachii artery, accompanies the radial nerve and winds around the humerus posteriorly and directly on the surface of the humerus in a groove called the radial groove. The brachial artery continues down the humerus on the medial side in between the ulnar nerve, which is medial to it, and the median nerve, which is lateral to it. The brachial artery, which is relatively superficial and can be palpated throughout its course down the humerus, lies anterior to the triceps and the brachialis. At first, it lies just medial to the humerus, where you can feel its pulsations in the medial bicipital groove. And then it passes anterior to the trochlea of the humerus into the cubital fossa. This is showing a picture of the brachial artery in the arm. This picture shows the brachial artery in the cubital fossa before it divides into the radial and ulnar arteries. The main named branches of the brachial artery that arise from its medial aspect are the deep brachial artery, or otherwise known as the profunda brachii artery, and the superior and inferior ulnar collateral arteries. The profunda brachii artery, which is the deep artery of the arm, is the largest branch of the brachial artery and has the most superior origin. The profunda brachii artery accompanies the radial nerve along the radial groove as it passes posteriorly around the shaft of the humerus. The profunda brachii terminates by dividing into middle and radial collateral arteries, and those arteries also participate in the anastomosis around the elbow. The superior ulnar collateral artery arises from the medial aspect of the brachial artery near the middle of the arm, and it also participates in the anastomosis of the elbow. The inferior ulnar collateral artery arises from the brachial artery just proximal, about 5 centimeters, from the elbow crease, and it also will join and participate the anastomosis of the elbow region. There's another branch of the brachial artery called the humeral nutrient artery, and this arises around the middle of the arm, and it enters the nutrient canal on the surface of the humerus. And that artery then runs distally in the canal of the humerus toward the elbow, so it helps to supply the bone itself. Here we see the profunda brachii artery, otherwise known as the deep brachial artery. And on this picture, we can see where this deep brachial artery emerges posteriorly and runs down the back of the arm. This slide is just reviewing the main branches of the brachial artery in the arm: the humeral nutrient artery, the superior ulnar collateral artery, and the inferior collateral artery. In these next couple of slides, we'll just see a review and pictures of these arteries. Here we see the subscapular artery, which is an artery coming from that third part of the axillary artery. Here's the anterior humeral circumflex, which is another branch off the third part of the axillary artery, as it supplies the anterior portion of the humerus, the proximal humerus. Here's the posterior circumflex artery that we see wrapping around to the posterior side of the proximal humerus. Here's the brachial artery, which is a continuation of the axillary artery. Here's the deep brachial artery, or the profunda brachii artery, as it branches off of the brachial artery. And now we'll look at the arteries of the forearm. The main arteries of the forearm are the ulnar and radial arteries. These are terminal branches of the brachial artery from the arm. They usually arise on the opposite sides of the neck of the radius in the inferior part of the cubital fossa. Pulsations of the ulnar artery can be palpated on the lateral side of the flexor carpi ulnaris tendon, where it lies just anterior to the ulnar head, so down by the wrist. The ulnar nerve is just medial to the ulnar artery in this area. Branches of the ulnar artery arise in the forearm and participate in the anastomosis around the elbow. These branches also supply muscles of the medial and central forearm. The pulsations of the radial artery can be felt throughout the forearm. These pulsations can be used as a boundary between the flexor compartment and the extensor compartment of the forearm. When the brachioradialis muscle is pulled laterally, the entire length of the artery is visible. The radial artery lies on muscle underneath the brachioradialis until it reaches the distal part of the forearm, and there it lies on the anterior surface of the radius bone, and it's only covered by skin and fascia, so it makes it an ideal location for checking the radial pulse. The course of the radial artery in the forearm is represented by a line that joins the midpoint of the cubital fossa to a point just medial to the radial styloid process. The radial artery then leaves the forearm by winding around the lateral aspect of the wrist and crosses the floor of the anatomical snuff box. This diagram is illustrating the radial artery underneath the brachioradialis muscle, which has been cut and reflected away. In this diagram, we see the brachial artery as it enters into the cubital fossa. And here we see the radial artery that branches off of the brachial artery. And here we see the ulnar artery as it branches off of the axillary artery. The hand is required to be placed and held in many different positions. It has to grasp things or apply pressure. So it has to be supplied with an abundance of highly branched and anastomosing arteries so that oxygenated blood is available to all parts of the hand in all positions. In addition, the arteries of the hands are relatively superficial. They're just underneath the skin. The skin of the hands are capable of sweating. Your hands sweat, and that way excess heat can be released. But in a cold environment, when you don't want excess heat being released and you want to maintain that heat within the body, the arterioles of the hands are capable of reducing blood flow to the surface and to the ends of the fingers. So the hand gets cold, but the rest of the body is able to maintain that heat. The ulnar and the radial arteries and their branches provide all the blood to the hand. The ulnar artery enters the hand just anterior to the flexor retinaculum, between the pisiform and the hook of the hamate on the palmar side. and it goes through an ulnar canal. The ulnar artery lies just lateral to the ulnar nerve. The artery divides into two terminal branches, the superficial palmar arch and the deep palmar arch. The superficial palmar arch is the main termination of the ulnar artery. It gives rise to three common palmar digital arteries, and those arteries anastomose with the palmar metacarpal arteries from the deep palmar arch. Each common palmar digital artery divides into a pair of proper palmar digital arteries, and they run along the adjacent sides of the second through the fourth digits. The radial artery curves dorsally around the scaphoid and the trapezium and then crosses the floor of the anatomical snuff box. It enters the palm by passing between the heads of the first dorsal interosseous muscle and then turns medially to pass between the heads of the adductor pollicis. The radial artery ends by anastomosing with the deep branch of the ulnar artery to form the deep palmar arch. This is a picture of the radial artery in the forearm, and then here we see the radial artery in the hand. This is a picture of the ulnar artery in the forearm, and here is a picture of the superficial palmar arch, which is a direct continuation of the ulnar artery. This shows the common digital arteries that arise from the superficial palmar arch, and here are the proper digital arteries that are branches of the common digital artery. This diagram illustrates the deep palmar arch that's a direct continuation of the radial artery. In this diagram, we can see the superficial palmar arch right here, and that gives rise to the common palmar digital arteries that we see right here, and then they divide to give rise to the proper palmar digital arteries. We can also see the deep palmar arch, which is a branch of primarily the radial artery. Next, we'll look at venous drainage of the upper limb. There are two sets of veins in the arm. There's the superficial veins of the upper limb, and there's the deep veins of the upper limb. The superficial veins of the arm include the basilic and the cephalic veins. The deep veins of the arm include the paired brachial veins and the axillary vein, and in the forearm include the paired ulnar, radial, and interosseous veins. The superficial and the deep veins anastomose freely with each other. The main superficial veins of the upper limb are the cephalic and basilic veins. They originate in the subcutaneous tissue on the dorsum of the hand from the dorsal venous network. The cephalic vein ascends in the subcutaneous tissue from the lateral aspect of the dorsal venous network in the hand and proceeds along the lateral border of the wrist and the anterolateral surface of the proximal forearm and arm. It's often visible through the skin. Anterior to the elbow, the cephalic vein communicates with the median cubital vein, which passes obliquely across the anterior aspect of the elbow in the cubital fossa, and then joins the basilic vein. The cephalic vein courses then superiorly between the deltoid and the pectoralis major muscles, and then enters the clavipectoral triangle. Then it will join the terminal part of the axillary vein. The basilic vein ascends in the subcutaneous tissue from the medial end of the dorsal venous network in the hand, along the medial side of the forearm and the inferior part of the arm. It also is visible often through the skin. Then it passes deeply near the junction of the middle and inferior thirds of the arm. It pierces through the brachial fascia and it runs superiorly and parallel with the brachial artery. The basilic vein courses into the axilla area, and there it joins other veins to form the axillary vein. This diagram is illustrating the basilic vein and the cephalic vein, and the anastomosis between the two, which is called the median cubital vein. Then we see the basilic vein joining the brachial veins to become the axillary vein, and we see the cephalic vein draining into the axillary vein. This diagram is illustrating how the cephalic vein can be visible through the skin. So we see this is an anterior view, and we see on the lateral side the cephalic vein can be seen through the skin, especially if there's a tourniquet in the brachial area. And then we see the basilic vein of the forearm that's visible as well. The median antecubital vein is otherwise known as the median vein of the forearm, and it is highly variable. It begins at the base of the dorsum of the thumb, it curves around the lateral side of the wrist, and it ascends in the middle of the anterior aspect of the forearm between the cephalic and the basilic veins. Sometimes it divides into a median basilic vein, which then joins the basilic vein, and a median cephalic vein, which joins the cephalic vein. This diagram is illustrating the cephalic vein in the forearm. And here we see the cephalic vein along the posterior humerus into the shoulder. This diagram shows the basilic vein in the forearm on the medial side. And here we see the basilic vein in the arm, again on the medial side. This is the median cubital vein, which is an area that anastomoses between the basilic vein on the medial side and the cephalic vein on the lateral side. Deep veins of the upper limb lie internal to the deep fascia. So in contrast to the superficial veins, they usually occur as paired veins that travel with or bear the same name as the major arteries of the limb. These deep veins begin at the deep venous palmar arch. They form radial and ulnar veins. They merge to form brachial veins, and then the brachial veins merge with the basilic vein to form the axillary vein. And then the cephalic vein drains into the axillary vein in the axilla. This diagram is illustrating the deep veins of the upper limb. We see the radial vein and the ulnar veins, which merge together to form the brachial veins. The brachial veins then merge with the basilic vein to become the axillary vein. This is another diagram where we can see the brachial veins merging with the basilic vein to become the axillary vein. And then we see the cephalic vein that drains into the axillary vein. This diagram is illustrating the digital veins and the dorsal venous network. So here we see the dorsal venous network on the posterior aspect of the hand. Merging from the thumb side or the lateral side of the dorsal venous network is branches going to the cephalic vein. And on the medial side of the dorsal venous network, branches enter into the basilic vein. In the upper right picture, we can see the veins through the hand. So we see on the lateral side, the veins from the dorsal venous network that will enter into the cephalic vein. And then on the medial side, we see the veins from the dorsal venous network that will enter into the basilic vein. The deep vein of the axilla is the axillary artery. This is a large vein that's formed by the union of the brachial vein, which are the accompanying veins of the brachial artery, and the basilic vein, just at the inferior border of the teres major. The axillary vein has three parts, just like the axillary artery, and the three parts of the axillary vein correspond with the three parts of the axillary artery. So the initial distal end is the third part, whereas the terminal proximal end is the first part. The first part of the axillary vein ends at the lateral border of the first rib, where it becomes the subclavian vein. The veins of the axilla are more abundant than the arteries, and they're also highly variable, and they frequently anastomose with each other. The axillary vein receives tributaries that generally correspond to branches of the axillary artery, with a few exceptions which we won't explain here. Paired deep veins, collectively constituting the brachial vein, accompany the brachial artery through the arm. The brachial veins have frequent connections that encompass or surround the artery and form sort of an anastomotic network around the artery within a common vascular sheath. And then the pulsations of the brachial artery help to move the blood in the brachial veins through this venous network back to the heart. The brachial vein begins at the elbow by the union of the accompanying veins of the ulnar and radial arteries. And the brachial vein ends by merging with the basilic vein to form the axillary vein. Not uncommonly, the deep veins join to form one brachial vein during part of their course. Deep veins that accompany arteries are very plentiful in the forearm. These accompanying veins arise from an anastomosing deep venous palmar arch in the hand. From the lateral side of the deep venous palmar arch, paired radial veins arise and they accompany the radial artery. From the medial side, paired ulnar veins arise and accompany the ulnar artery. These veins that are accompanying each artery will frequently anastomose with each other. The radial and ulnar veins drain the forearm, but they carry very little blood from the hand. This is a picture showing the deep palmar venous arch, and on the lateral side, we see how that drains into the radial veins, and on the medial side, we see how it drains into the ulnar veins. This is a picture of the deep venous palmar arch. In the hand, there are superficial and deep venous palmar arches. These are associated with the superficial and deep palmar arterial arches. The superficial and deep venous palmar arches drain into the deep veins of the forearm. The dorsal digital veins drain into three dorsal metacarpal veins. They unite to form a dorsal venous network. The cephalic vein arises from the lateral side of this dorsal venous arch, whereas the basilic vein arises from the medial side of this dorsal venous network. Here we're seeing the radial vein in the cubital fossa. Here's the ulnar vein in the cubital fossa. And here's where we see the radial and ulnar vein drain into the brachial veins in the arm. This is a picture of the dorsal venous network, which is on the back of the hand. And here's a picture of the radial vein in a cadaver. And here's where we would see the ulnar vein in a cadaver. The radial and ulnar veins unite to form the brachial vein in the cubital area. So we're looking at the anterior arm and we can see where the brachial vein begins. And then we can see the brachial veins as they enter into the arm up toward the axilla. Here we see the axillary vein, which is the union of the brachial veins and the basilic vein. And here we see where the axillary vein becomes the subclavian vein on the left, and this happens at the lateral border of the first rib. This ends our video on the vasculature of the upper limb.